In today's video, we're talking about opposite and absolute values. We're still in Unit 1, so we're still coloring purple. Alright, opposites and absolute values. Numbers are considered opposites if they have opposite signs. So they're considered opposites if they have opposite signs. The opposite of a positive number is a negative number. And the opposite of a negative number is a positive number. Okay. And remember, integers are all the counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. They're opposites, negatives, and 0. 0 is kind of special. 0 is the only number that does not have an opposite. Alright, so let's think about this first one. You've got to think of the negative sign as an opposite sign instead. So when you see that negative sign, really you want to think about the opposite of and then whatever's in the parentheses. So in words, we would write this as the opposite of positive 2. So the opposite of positive 2. The opposite of positive 2. So what is the opposite of positive 2? We're going to skip this number line section right here. The opposite of positive 2 is going to be negative 2. Okay, let's think about this one right here. The opposite of negative 4. The opposite of negative 4. So what is the opposite of negative 4? Well, it's going to be a positive 4. And again, we can just write 4 without that plus sign. Okay? And if you want to draw your number lines out here on this side, so if we think about the opposite of positive 2, here's 0. Here's positive 2. It's 2 hops in the direction to the right. If we go 2 hops in the direction to the left, we end up at negative 2. So the opposite would be negative 2. Alright, this one right here, I'll put 0, and I've gotten 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's negative 4, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4 hops left. We go in the opposite direction, the same number of hops, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we wind up at positive 4. So the opposite is positive 4. There's kind of a picture to go along with that. Alright, the distance a number is from 0 on the number line is called absolute value. The absolute value of a number is always a positive. If you think about distance, you can't walk a negative 10 feet. You can only walk 10 feet. So distance is a quantity that should always be positive. Alright, so let's think about this. These little parallel lines here, these short little parallel lines here and here, those mean absolute value. So we read this as the absolute value of 2. The absolute value of 2. And if we think about 2 on a number line, so here's 0, here's 1, 2. The distance to 0, I go 1 space, 2 spaces. My distance to 0 is 2 spaces, so the absolute value is going to be 2. Right. This one, absolute value symbol, the absolute value of, and then I read this number in here, negative 4, so negative 4. And again, if I think of my number line, I put 0 on it. Here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. And I think about the number of jumps to 0. I'm jumping 1 space, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 4 spaces. So I'm jumping 4 spaces in order to get to 0. So the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. Okay? Sometimes problems have both an opposite sign and an absolute value sign. So if you look at this one, notice that the negative sign or that opposite sign is hanging out outside the absolute value symbols. So this one is a little bit trickier to read, a little bit more words. We start with the first symbol we see, which is the opposite. So we read this as the opposite of the absolute value. So the opposite of the absolute value of 2. Okay, so let's think about this on a picture. Okay, here is 0. Think about my number, which is 2. So I'm starting at 2. It takes me 2 hops to get to 0, so that's the absolute value. So 2 spaces to 0, and then I'm taking the opposite of 2 spaces to 0, so the opposite of 2 is -2. Okay, and this one, a little bit more complicated even. So we start with the opposite of the absolute value of -4. So if I think about this one on the number line, here's 0, here's 1, 2, 3, -4. That's 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops, 4 hops to 0. So I move 4 spaces. So then if I move 4 spaces, I take the opposite of 4, which gives me -4. A little trick, if you see the opposite on the outside of the absolute value, that's going to give you a negative number. If you see the opposite or that negative sign on the inside, you're going to end up with a positive number. All right. I hope that helps you understand the difference between opposites and absolute values.